Welcome to Order Before Modern Systems. Here, we explore how everyday order functioned before modern systems, institutions, and formal rules existed. This channel examines how routine, habit, and shared expectations shaped daily life long before modern organization took form. For most of human history, there were no professional police departments like the ones many countries have today. There were laws, courts, and punishments, but everyday order depended mainly on ordinary people. In many places, most people really did know what to do most of the time: how to behave in public, how to handle conflicts, how to show respect, how to trade fairly, and when to involve local authorities. This was not because people were naturally calmer or more obedient. It was because older communities ran on strong systems that taught behavior through repetition, observation, and imitation, and enforced it through shared responsibility, local reputation, and predictable consequences. This script explains how those systems worked. It focuses on how communities maintained stable daily life before modern law enforcement, and why unwritten rules could feel as strong as written law. First, it helps to separate two ideas. One idea is law, official rules backed by a recognized authority, like a king, a city council, a lord, or a religious court. Law often deals with serious harm, property disputes, or public order. The other idea is norms, expected behavior in daily life, like how to greet someone, how to dress for an occasion, how to speak in a meeting, how to treat a guest, what counts as fair dealing, and how to show that you belong. In many historical societies, norms were the first line of order. Formal law was often the second line, used when norms failed or when a problem became too serious to ignore. A key reason norms worked is that pre-modern communities were usually small and repeated the same activities again and again. Most people lived near where they were born. They used the same fields, wells, streets, markets, and places of worship. They met the same families year after year. Work followed seasons and routines. Religious calendars and local festivals repeated. Trade repeated. Family life repeated. When life repeats, behavior becomes a kind of shared skill. Children did not learn rules mainly from written lists. They learned by watching and copying. They followed older siblings, parents, neighbors, and masters. They learned what happened when someone broke expectations. They also learned what earned approval. This kind of learning has three parts: repetition, doing the same tasks in the same ways until it feels normal; observation, watching how respected people behave, especially in public; imitation, copying the behavior that brings safety, acceptance, and success. In communities where daily life is highly visible, these three forces are very strong. Visibility mattered. In many villages and town neighborhoods, privacy was limited. Homes were close. Work was often done outdoors or in shared spaces. Markets and churches were public. When you interacted with others, they remembered. Because people saw each other constantly, reputation became a form of social control. Your reputation affected who traded with you, who hired you, who trusted you, who married into your family, and who helped you in hard times. So many people did not need to be told how to behave every day. They already knew what behavior protected their standing. This does not mean everyone followed norms perfectly. People argued, cheated, fought, and offended each other. But norms created a default setting that most people returned to because the cost of constant conflict was too high. To understand why, it helps to think about the main tools communities used to keep order before modern policing. One tool was shared expectations. In many places, custom was a kind of law in practice, even when it was not written down. People expected certain ways of handling debts, boundaries, inheritance, marriage agreements, and work duties. Local courts often relied on what the community considered customary. Custom was powerful because it did not feel new. It felt inherited. That made it harder to challenge. Another tool was social pressure. Social pressure includes praise, blame, gossip, public criticism, exclusion, and loss of trust. These seem mild compared to prison, but in small communities they could be severe. If others avoided you, you might lose work, credit, and help during illness or famine. You could become unsafe. A third tool was collective responsibility. In several European settings, especially medieval England, systems of mutual responsibility linked neighbours together. One famous example is the Frankpledge system, where many men were grouped in units often described as tithings, and the group could be held responsible for producing a suspect or paying a fine if someone fled. The idea was simple. If your neighbours may suffer for your actions, they will watch you closely and pressure you to behave. This kind of system made the community part of enforcement. It also reduced the need for full-time officers. A fourth tool was rapid communal response. In medieval English law practice, the hue and cry required people to raise an alarm and for neighbours to help pursue a suspected criminal. This was not a casual suggestion. It was treated as a duty of the community. In such a system, the response to wrongdoing could be immediate and local, because the community itself was expected to act. A fifth tool was local officials who were not modern police. Many places used part-time or rotating local officers, constables, watchmen, beadles, or similar roles. These people were often locals, unpaid or lightly paid, serving for a limited term. Their job was to carry out orders, keep basic peace, and help with arrests and summons. Because they lived among the people, they relied heavily on community cooperation. And because they had to continue living there afterward, they often used discretion. This is one reason norms mattered so much. They guided what the community would tolerate and when it would demand stronger action. A sixth tool was public, predictable punishment. Pre-modern punishment systems were often meant to be seen. Fines, public shaming, or physical penalties were not just about the offender. They were signals to everyone else about the boundaries of acceptable behavior. In many places, even when formal law existed, the certainty of social consequences mattered more than the exact written rule. People learned the boundaries because they saw what happened to those who crossed them. Now consider the central question: why did most people know what to do without being told? One major reason is that norms were taught as practical knowledge, not as abstract theory. In modern life, many rules are written down. People can move to a new city, start a new job, and receive a handbook. But in earlier periods, you learned social rules, mainly the way you learned farming, weaving, building, or cooking. You watched. You tried. You were corrected. Correction could be gentle, like a warning from an elder. It could also be sharp, like ridicule or exclusion. Either way, the feedback was fast. Another major reason is that daily life ran through repeated public rituals. Markets repeated weekly, religious services repeated, seasonal labor repeated, courts and assemblies repeated, festivals repeated, family events repeated. These were not only religious or economic events, they were training grounds for behavior. People learned where to stand, when to speak, who goes first, who yields, what clothing is appropriate, how to negotiate, how to apologize, and how to show respect. When behavior is rehearsed in public again and again, it becomes habit. Habit is one of the strongest sources of stability. Habit reduces the need for constant decision-making. It makes behavior automatic, and when many people share the same habits, society becomes predictable. Predictability is valuable because it lowers conflict. If you can predict how others will behave, you can plan work, trade, and family life. A third reason is that identity was tied closely to place and role. In many historical settings, a person's role was relatively stable: child, apprentice, journeyman, master, tenant, landlord, wife, husband, widow, elder, newcomer, outsider. Each role came with expected behavior. This could be restrictive, but it also made social life easier to navigate. If you knew someone's role, you often knew how to address them, what you owed them, and what they owed you. When roles are stable, norms are easier to learn and enforce. A fourth reason is that economic survival depended on trust. In many pre-modern economies, credit was informal. People borrowed tools, seed, animals, and money through personal relationships. Deals were made with witnesses and reputation. If your name became associated with dishonesty, others could refuse to trade or extend credit. So fairness was not only a moral value, it was practical. Even people who wanted to cheat had reasons to limit cheating, because they needed to keep doing business. This is how observation and imitation created stability. A young person watched which adults were trusted, which ones were avoided, and what behaviors led to each outcome. A fifth reason is that dispute resolution was often local and communal. In many places, conflicts were handled first through a negotiation between families, neighbors, or guild members. If that failed, people might go to a local court. Local courts in medieval and early modern Europe could include manorial courts and similar forums. These courts dealt with many everyday matters and relied on local knowledge. They helped turn custom into enforceable decisions. When people see that disputes will be judged by neighbors who know them, they have an extra reason to behave in ways the community respects. A sixth reason is that many societies linked morality, religion, and law. Religious institutions often shape daily behavior. Confession, public penance, moral teaching, and community discipline could support secular order. Even in places where the religious and political authorities were separate, the moral language of wrongdoing could overlap with legal punishment. This does not mean people always behaved well because of belief. It means moral teaching reinforced social expectations, and people learned the boundaries through repeated instruction and example. Seventh reason is that some societies used formal regulation of everyday life. In early modern Europe, for example, many cities and states issued sumptuary laws, which tried to regulate clothing and consumption by rank, profession, or gender. These laws were often detailed and enforcement varied, but they show something important. Authorities knew that visible signs like clothing mattered for social order. Even when such laws were not perfectly enforced, the attempt itself reinforced the idea that proper appearance and behavior were public concerns. A similar principle appeared in other regions through different institutions. For example, in some medieval Islamic cities, the office often called the mutasib was associated with market supervision and public conduct, especially in relation to honest trade practices such as weights and measures. This shows another way older societies tried to keep daily life orderly by supervising public spaces where strangers interacted, especially markets. These examples point to the same basic need. When there is no large professional force to investigate and patrol, society depends heavily on predictable routines, local oversight, and shared expectations. Now it helps to clarify an important point. Knowing what to do did not mean people were always gentle or fair. Some norms protected the weak, but many protected the powerful. Some norms promoted honesty, but others enforced hierarchy. Some norms reduced violence, but others allowed violence under certain conditions. This script is not saying older systems were better. It is explaining why they often worked at keeping daily life stable. Stability came from a balance of incentives and risks. The incentives were belonging, trust, trade, marriage ties, help in emergencies, and social standing. The risks were shame, fines, exclusion, retaliation, and legal punishment. Because these incentives and risks were constantly present, most people did not need reminders every day. They learned the system early, they watched it constantly, and they knew the likely consequences. Next, Consider how investigation worked without modern detectives. In many pre-modern settings, investigation was simpler because the suspect pool was smaller. In a small village, everyone often knew who owned what, who had debts, who had conflicts, and who was present at a given time. That does not guarantee justice, and it could create unfair accusations, but it made many cases rely less on technical investigation and more on community knowledge. When a theft occurred, the question might be who had motive, who had access, who has a history, who was seen, and who is trusted. Witnesses mattered greatly. So did oaths and reputation. Even when formal procedures existed, communities often treated a person's past behavior as evidence of what they would do now. This again ties back to norms. Everyday behavior was not separate from justice. It was part of the evidence people used. Now consider punishment. Many older punishments aimed at restoring balance, not only isolating the offender. Fines were common, so were compensation payments. In some legal traditions, wrongdoing created an obligation that could be paid, sometimes according to the social status of the victim and offender. Systems that use compensation often depend on families or kin groups to help pay and to pressure their members to avoid creating costs. This kind of structure encourages self-policing inside groups. If your kin, household, or neighbors may have to pay for your actions, they will teach you what to do long before you face a judge. That is another reason people knew what to do. Their group trained them because the group had reasons to control risk. Public punishment also worked as instruction, seeing fines imposed, hearing judgments, watching shame penalties, or seeing property seized taught people where the line was. This was education through example. It was not subtle, but it was effective at spreading information in societies where not everyone read and where official announcements traveled slowly. Now look at daily life again. When people live with repeated routines, they develop scripts for behavior. A script here means a learned pattern. If this happens, do that. If you meet an elder, you show respect. If you enter a market, you use known measures and prices, and you avoid being labeled dishonest. If a neighbor's animal damages your crops, you follow a known path, complaint, witness, local authority, compensation. If you hear an alarm, you respond, because you might be legally required and because next time you may need the same help. These scripts are not written in a handbook, but they are carried in memory and repeated in practice. This is why observation and imitation matter so much. You do not need to memorize every rule if you can copy what works. And in many historical communities, copying what works was safer than experimenting. Experimenting with behavior could be costly. In a modern city, you can offend strangers and never see them again. In a small village, the offended person might be your trading partner next week and your witness in court next month. So the environment rewarded caution, conformity, and predictable behavior. At the same time, societies were not frozen. Norms changed slowly and sometimes quickly during crises. Plagues, wars, economic changes, urban growth, and state reforms could weaken older systems. For example, as towns grew larger, purely communal response systems struggled, and authorities leaned more on appointed watchmen and constables. When populations became more mobile, reputation could weaken because people could leave. When trade expanded, strangers interacted more, and local knowledge was less useful. These pressures helped push some societies toward more professional policing and bureaucratic courts. But for long periods, the older systems worked well enough to keep daily life from constant chaos. They did so by making behavior a shared skill, learned early, reinforced daily, and corrected quickly. To sum up, most people in many historical periods knew what to do because the social environment trained them constantly. They learned through repetition, the same routines, the same tasks, the same public events. They learned through observation, watching respected adults, seeing how disputes were handled, and noticing what behavior brought approval or blame. They learned through imitation, copying what kept them included, trusted, and safe. And they were supported by systems that made behavior, everyone is business, reputation, local courts, collective responsibility, communal pursuit, part-time local officers, and public punishments. These systems were not perfect, and they were not equally fair to everyone. But they explain why order could exist without modern law enforcement, and why people often seem to understand the rules of life without needing to be told them every day. In a world where the community watched, remembered, and responded, knowing how to behave was not an extra lesson. It was part of survival, part of work, and part of belonging.